I never thought parking a car could destroy my entire peace. But in this neighborhood, everything is a weapon. Every lawn, every mailbox, every glare from across the street. And my car, my beautiful black Rolls Royce, it wasn't just a car to her. It was war. She dialed the cops with shaking hands, her voice dripping with rage, and the moment the sirens came down our street, I knew my life here would never be the same. Because this time, it wasn't just about the HOA. It was about survival. And someone was going to break tonight. Welcome back to Mad HOA, where the quiet streets of suburbia hide the loudest battles. My name is David. I'm 32 years old, and I just moved into this so-called perfect community in Florida. I run a small business online. I mind my own life. I pay my dues. But the HOA here doesn't care who you are. They care about one thing: control. And the moment I parked my Rolls Royce in my driveway, I became their #1 target. I became their #1 target the moment my Rolls Royce touched that driveway. I didn't realize it at first. I thought people would be curious, maybe impressed, maybe even a little jealous. But in a neighborhood ruled by an HOA, jealousy is a weapon, and curiosity can turn into hatred overnight. It started small, little looks, whispers when I drove past, a neighbor pretending to water his lawn just to stare at me as I pulled in. I waved. He didn't wave back. I laughed, because I thought it was funny. I thought, what kind of people care this much about a car? But then I saw her. Karen, the HOA president. She was standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, hair pulled tight like a rope, lips pressed so hard they almost disappeared. She didn't wave either. Instead, she lifted her phone, snapped a picture of my car, and went inside. The next mosh. Royce os onmod. Warning. A paper was taped to my front door. Violation notice. Your vehicle is not in compliance with the community aesthetic. The words were typed, but the anger behind them was personal. I laughed again, thought maybe it was a prank. Maybe this was just some HOA formality that meant nothing. But then another notice came, and another, every day, taped to my door like a scarlet letter, my mailbox filled with emails. Fines piling up for excessive shine, inappropriate luxury display, and my favorite one, community disruption by way of automobile. I didn't know whether to be angry or to frame these letters as art. I tried to ignore it, but ignoring Karen was like ignoring a storm. She got louder, meaner, more desperate. She stood on her porch at night, staring at me, like I had stolen something from her. She whispered to other neighbors, and the whispers grew into meetings, and the meetings turned into votes. Votes about me, about my car, about whether I fit. The absurdity of it all. It was like living inside a bad reality show. I could feel the eyes on me every time I came home, the blinds shifting. The kids told not to play near my driveway. The neighborhood was changing around me, and not in a way I expected. One night, I walked outside and saw a note stuck under my windshield. It was written in red ink, big angry letters. Sell the car or leave before we make you. And at the bottom, smeared lipstick kiss. I held it in my hand under the porch light, and for the first time, I didn't laugh. This wasn't a game anymore. This was war. I thought about reporting it. But how do you report an HOA president? She was the one filing complaints against me. She was the one who claimed authority here. And she wasn't just any neighbor. She was the queen bee, the kind of person who thrived on control, who needed everyone else to bend. So I did what anyone stubborn would do. I parked the Rolls Royce right in the middle of my driveway every single night, front and center, like a crown jewel she couldn't take away. And every time I did, I saw her lights flick on across the street. Her blinds would move, just a little, just enough for me to see her watching. It became a silent battle. Me and her. Driveway against porch, engine against whispers. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure grew. I started hearing rumors. Neighbors telling me she was building a case, that she was planning something bigger. I brushed it off, but the tension in the air was real. Then one morning, the sound of sirens filled the cul-de-sac. I stepped outside and saw 2 police cars pulling in, lights flashing red and blue against the perfect suburban houses. Karen came running out in her robe, her hair wild, her voice shrill like a fire alarm. She pointed at me, at my car, screaming loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Officers, he stole that car." Phones came out. Neighbors rushed to their lawns, recording, whispering, gasping. I stood there in silence, leaning against the hood of my car, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like some twisted play. The officers approached, calm but cautious, their hands near their belts. Karen was frantic, throwing words like daggers: criminal, fraud, trash. I gave the cops my license, my registration, every document clean and perfect, but Karen didn't stop. She shouted louder, desperate now. "This doesn't belong to him. It doesn't belong in our neighborhood." And then the officer said something I'll never forget. "Sir, for your own safety, we're going to place you in handcuffs until this is sorted out." The sound of metal clicking around my wrists echoed louder than any siren. The crowd gasped, and Karen's face lit up like Christmas morning. She smiled, wide and satisfied, like she had finally won. I looked around at my neighbors, some shaking their heads, others hiding grins. A few even, filming up close. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it, I felt something else, a question burning inside me. Louder than the sirens, louder than Karen's screams. How far would she really go, just to destroy me? The cuffs were cold, heavy. They dug into my skin with every move I made. I wasn't afraid, not yet, but I was humiliated. Neighbors stood in clusters, whispering, pointing their phones at me like I was some cheap circus act. And Karen, she stood there glowing with satisfaction, her robe tied too tight, her grin too wide. She had been waiting for this moment, planning it, craving it. The officer led me a few steps away from my car. He was calm, professional, his voice steady, but I could feel the judgment in the air, the unspoken words hanging between every breath, the Rolls Royce, the cuffs, the neighborhood that thrived on gossip. This wasn't justice. This was theater. Karen followed us, throwing accusations like confetti. "He's a fraud. He doesn't live here legally. He scammed his way into this place." Her voice cracked with excitement, her hands waving in the air. I wanted to laugh, but the cuffs reminded me that this wasn't funny. This was serious. The officer looked at my registration again. Everything was perfect, clean, legal, but procedure is procedure, and appearances matter in a place like this. "Sir, just stay calm. We'll figure this out." That's what he said. But I could feel the weight of Karen's shadow pressing down. I glanced back at my car, the sun bouncing off the polished black hood. To me, it was just metal and wheels, but to her, it was a symbol of everything she couldn't control, everything she envied, everything she hated. As the officer radioed in my information, Karen stepped closer to the crowd of neighbors. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. "This is what happens when you let people like him in." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they carried poison. And I could see the effect in the faces of the crowd. Doubt, curiosity, some even nodding along. In that moment, she wasn't just fighting me. She was rewriting the story. The second officer finally spoke. "Karen, step back. We'll handle this." But she didn't. She stood tall, chest puffed out, as if the street itself belonged to her. And in a way, it did. She had ruled this place for years, bending rules, twisting words, breaking anyone who dared to resist. The radio crackled. The officer glanced at me, then at Karen. "Registrations clean, cars clear, nothing stolen." His words cut through the crowd, slicing her smile into pieces. Karen froze, her lips trembling, her face shifting from triumph to disbelief. But before I could savor it, the officer added something that made my stomach drop. "Still, given the disturbance, we're taking him down to the station to file a report." The crowd erupted, gasps, murmurs, and Karen's smile returned like a fire reigniting. She didn't care about the truth. She cared about the scene, me, in handcuffs, dragged out of the perfect neighborhood like an outlaw. That was enough for her as they guided me toward the cruiser. I caught sight of a few neighbors watching silently. One man nodded slightly, almost like he was on my side. Another woman turned away, ashamed, as if she knew this was wrong. But nobody spoke up. Nobody stopped it. In a neighborhood ruled by fear, silence is loyalty. The car door opened, the back seat waiting like a cage, and just as I was about to step in, a voice called out, "Wait." It was deep, steady, confident. Every head turned, including mine. A tall man walked down the street, suit perfectly pressed, briefcase in hand. He looked calm, but his eyes burned with purpose. My lawyer. He had arrived just in time, and with him came a folder, thick with paper, evidence, truth. He showed the officers everything, my ownership documents, my business records, even letters from Karen herself. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of the truth heavier than the cuffs on my wrists. One of them sighed, shook his head, and unlocked me. The click of freedom was louder than the sirens. I rubbed my wrists, feeling the blood rush back. Karen's face twisted into something I can't forget. Rage mixed with humiliation, a mask cracking in public. The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, if you continue filing false reports, there will be consequences." The words hung in the air, sharper than any blade. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their queen exposed for a second. Silence ruled the street, but Karen wasn't done, not even close. She stormed back to her porch, her robe flapping in the wind, and shouted over her shoulder, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." And I knew she meant it. The crowd slowly dispersed, whispers trailing off into the night, but the damage was done. My reputation, my peace, my safety, all stained by her obsession. Even if I had won that battle, the war had just begun, back inside my house. I sat in the dark. The neighborhood felt different now, colder, sharper. Every shadow on the street looked like her eyes watching me. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like her footsteps on my porch. She wasn't just an HOA president anymore, she was a predator. And I was her prey. I wondered what she would do next. Would she try to sabotage my business? Would she send more letters? Would she gather the board to vote me out? The possibilities twisted in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. And yet, deep down, part of me felt something else. Not fear, not defeat, but defiance. Because if she wanted a war, I wasn't going to back down. I had worked too hard for this life, for this car, and for this home, and no HOA president was going to steal that from me. The night dragged on, heavy and restless. I thought about moving, but the thought burned in my chest like weakness. Leaving would mean she won, and I couldn't give her that satisfaction. So I made a decision. I was going to fight back, not with fists, not with anger, but with patience and precision, the same way she used rules and words against me. I would use them against her, revenge by compliance. Every line in the HOA handbook, every absurd rule, every technicality, I would turn her own system into her prison. But as I sat there, staring out the window at her porch light glowing across the street, I realized something even darker. This wasn't just about a car, this was about control. And Karen wasn't going to stop until one of us broke. The war didn't end that night. It only began. Karen's porch light became my reminder, glowing like a warning sign across the street. Every time I looked out my window, it was there. Every time I stepped outside, I felt her eyes on me. She wasn't just watching, she was plotting. The next morning, another letter appeared on my door. But this time it wasn't a violation notice. It was thicker, heavier, official-looking. Inside was a summons. Karen had called a special HOA board meeting, and the only name on the agenda was mine. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the paper, sipping cold coffee. She wanted me out. And this meeting was her battlefield that night. I walked into the community hall, rows of folding chairs, a long table at the front, and at the center, Karen. Her smile was thin, sharp, like a blade waiting to cut. The board members sat beside her, stiff suits, blank eyes, nodding like puppets, and behind me, the neighbors filled the room, whispering, recording, waiting for drama. Karen stood and cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man has brought disruption, shame, and danger into our neighborhood. Her voice was clear, rehearsed, every word dripping with poison. She winted at me like I was already guilty. He refuses to follow rules, he intimidates families, and his vehicle is a public nuisance. The crowd shifted, some nodding, others silent. I felt the tension like a rope tightening around my chest, but I stayed calm. I knew her game, and I was ready to play mine. When it was my turn, I stood slow, steady. My name is David. I pay my dues. I follow the rules. I held up the letters, the fines, the threats. And yet every day I am harassed, targeted, and dragged through the mud for owning a car that is perfectly legal. The room went quiet, the weight of my words cutting through the noise. Some neighbors looked guilty, others uncomfortable. Karen's face twitched, just a little, just enough for me to see the crack in her armor, but then she leaned forward, eyes narrow. You don't belong here, and this community knows it. The board nodded, robotic, like they were under her spell, and for a moment, I wondered if the battle was lost before it even began. Then I remembered my plan. Revenge by compliance. I reached into my folder and pulled out something she didn't expect. The HOA handbook. I began reading their own rules aloud, every line, every absurd detail. No car is banned if it is registered and operable. No homeowner may be fined without documented evidence of actual damage. No member may use their position to harass or threaten a resident. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers grew louder, and Karen's smile faded into stone. The board shuffled in their seats, uncomfortable now. One even cleared his throat. Mumbling something about fairness, Karen slammed her hand on the table. This isn't about rules, it's about order. Her voice cracked, her power slipping. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Neighbors arguing, some siding with me, others too afraid to speak. The board called for silence. But control was gone. Karen stormed out, robe flaring like a cape, slamming the door behind her. That night, I thought maybe I had won, but victories in suburbia are illusions, because the next morning, my lawn was destroyed. The grass, perfect and green just hours before, was now torn into patches, spray paint across my fence. Ugly words I won't repeat, and at the center of my driveway, a broken egg smeared across the hood of my Rolls Royce. I stared at it in disbelief. This wasn't just Karen anymore. This was war turned dirty. And she had soldiers. I cleaned the mess, fixed the lawn, repainted the fence, but deep down I knew every repair was just another invitation for her to strike again. She wanted me rattled, broken, desperate, and for a moment, I almost was. But then something unexpected happened. One of my neighbors, the quiet man from 2 houses down, knocked on my door. He looked nervous, kept glancing over his shoulder. I saw who did it, he whispered. And then he told me everything. It wasn't kids. It wasn't random. It was Karen's nephew. The same one who sometimes stayed at her house. She had sent him, ordered him, to destroy my property. And now, I had proof. My neighbor even had photos, taken from his security camera. Karen's nephew, spray can in hand, eggs in his bag. The evidence was undeniable. For the first time, the scales tipped in my favor. I filed a report with the police, calmly, carefully. And when they showed up at Karen's door, the look on her face was priceless. Shock, denial, rage. But none of it mattered. The damage was done, and this time, she couldn't hide. Still, I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Karen was cornered now, and a cornered enemy is the most dangerous kind. She wouldn't stop. She couldn't. This wasn't about cars anymore, or rules. This was personal, and I could feel the storm building again. That night I sat in my living room, staring out the window at her house. Her porch light was still on, burning bright, daring me to look away, and I thought to myself, how far will she go this time? What line will she cross next? And how long before this quiet suburban street turns into a battlefield no one can ignore? The neighborhood felt different after that night. Karen had been caught, exposed. Her nephew dragged into the spotlight for vandalism. For a moment, I thought the war was finally turning in my favor. But with Karen, Being cornered only made her more dangerous. Her porch light stayed on, brighter than before, like a watchtower. She didn't wave. She didn't glare. She just stood there sometimes, frozen, staring across the street at me, silent, plotting. And somehow, that silence was worse than all the shouting. The next morning, another letter arrived in my mailbox. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten, sharp letters. Ink pressed so hard it tore the page. You might have won this round, but you don't belong here. No name, no signature, but I didn't need one. I knew exactly whose hand had written it. I laughed at first, but deep down I felt the chill, because this wasn't just petty fines or fake violations anymore. This was psychological warfare. Days turned into weeks, and the attacks came in strange new ways. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night, silence on the other end, notes slipped under my door. Leave before it's too late. Flyers showing up on neighbors' mailboxes, claiming I was a criminal, a scammer, a liar. It was Karen's new strategy, not to fight me in the open, but to poison me in the shadows. And it worked. Neighbors who once smiled at me stopped making eye contact. The woman who used to wave while jogging now crossed the street to avoid me. The kids who played basketball down the block suddenly vanished when I stepped outside. Karen had turned me into an outcast, and in a community like this, isolation is power, but I refused to break. If she wanted to fight in the dark, then I would bring everything into the light. I started keeping records, every letter, every note, every phone call. I installed cameras around my house, every angle covered, every shadow recorded, and slowly, the evidence piled up like bricks in a wall, because I knew one day I would need it all. One evening, I was sitting in my driveway, polishing the hood of my Rolls Royce. When I saw her, Karen walked across the street with a clipboard in hand. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak. She simply bent down, measured the height of my mailbox with a ruler, and scribbled something down. Then she moved to my lawn, pulling out a small sample of grass, tucking it into a plastic bag like a detective at a crime scene. I just sat there, watching, half amused, half horrified. She was building her case again, later that week. I received a thick envelope. Inside was a list of new violations. Mailbox 2 inches too tall, grass not consistent with community shade of green, car parked at an angle not harmonious with neighborhood flow. The absurdity made me laugh so hard I almost cried, but I also knew the truth. Karen wasn't stupid. She was baiting me, hoping I would explode, lose my temper, give her the one mistake she needed. Instead, I decided to play her game, revenge by compliance, the next morning. I measured my mailbox to the exact millimeter she wanted. I ordered new fertilizer to match the ridiculous shade of green the handbook demanded. I parked the car with surgical precision, perfectly parallel to the driveway lines. Every rule, every line, every absurd detail, I followed them all so perfectly that even Karen couldn't twist them against me, and it drove her insane. I saw her pacing her porch, phone pressed to her ear, probably calling every board member she had in her pocket, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't catch me breaking anything, because I wasn't Jeta. Just following the rules, I was weaponizing them. The neighbors started to notice too. Some whispered about how ridiculous it had become. Others quietly admitted they admired the way I refused to bend. The tide was shifting, slowly, painfully, but shifting nonetheless. Then one night, it all boiled over. I came home late, the street quiet, the sky heavy with clouds, and there she was, standing at the end of my driveway, her arms crossed, her eyes burning. She didn't move as I pulled in, didn't blink as I stepped out of the car. She just stared at me, silent, until finally she spoke. "You think you're clever," she said, her voice low, shaking with anger. "But you don't understand. I built this neighborhood. I run it, and I will bury you before I let you win." I wanted to laugh, but the way she said it, it wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The next day, another meeting notice arrived, but this one was different. Not a board meeting, not an HOA vote. This was a summons to appear in HOA court. Yes, HOA court, a private hearing where the board acted like judge and jury, deciding the fate of anyone accused of community disruption. And this time, I wasn't just accused of violations, I was accused of endangering the harmony of the community. I held the letter in my hand, shaking my head. It sounded like something out of a bad movie, but in this neighborhood, it was very real. I knew what it meant. Karen was done playing in the shadows. She was dragging me into her arena, and if I wasn't careful, she could actually win the night before the hearing. I sat at my desk surrounded by papers, the handbook, the violation notices, the photos from my neighbor, the recordings from my cameras, every piece of evidence laid out like weapons on a battlefield. But as I stared at it all, one thought kept clawing at the back of my mind. What if none of it mattered? What if the board was already hers? What if I walked into that room tomorrow, and no matter what I said, I lost? The thought chilled me, but it also hardened me, because I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person in that neighborhood who had been bullied into silence, every family fined for nonsense, every homeowner too scared to fight back if I lost. Karen's reign continued, but if I won, maybe, just maybe, her empire would crack. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at her house across the street. Her light was still on, glowing like a challenge, and I whispered to myself, tomorrow, everything changes. The morning of the hearing came heavy and gray. Clouds pressed low over the street, the kind of sky that made everything feel colder than it was. I buttoned my shirt slow, steady, like I was suiting up for battle, across the street. Karen's porch light was still on, but she wasn't standing there this time. Her driveway was empty, her blinds closed. It felt like silence before a storm. The HOA court was held in the same community hall where we had our last meeting, but today it looked different, darker somehow. The long table at the front was draped with papers, the board seated in stiff rows like judges from some old movie, and in the center, Karen sat tall, her hair pulled back tight, her face stretched in that same thin smile. She didn't look at me when I walked in, but I could feel her confidence dripping across the room. She believed today was her victory lap. The neighbors had come too, not all of them, but enough to fill the chairs, phones in hand, whispers already spreading before anything even began. This wasn't just a hearing, this was theater, and I was the show. The head of the board cleared his throat. We are here to address the disruption caused by resident David and determine necessary action for the preservation of community harmony. His voice was flat, rehearsed, the words sliding off his tongue like they had been written by Karen herself. Karen rose slowly, like a queen taking her place on stage. She held a stack of papers, waved them in the air for everyone to see. "This man," she began, "has broken the spirit of this neighborhood since the day he arrived." Her voice carried across the hall, loud, sharp. "He flaunts wealth. He refuses respect. He poisons our community with arrogance and hostility." She turned to me then, her eyes narrow, her smile sharp. "And worse, he threatens our safety." Gasps rippled through the crowd, neighbors leaning forward, eager for drama. She laid down photos, pictures of me standing near my car, photos of me polishing the hood late at night, screenshots of comments from some online page where she had written lies under my name. To her, these were weapons. To anyone else, they were shadows dressed as facts. When it was my turn, I stood, calm, steady, holding my folder of evidence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I simply laid out the truth, the violation notices, the absurd fines, the lipstick-stained threat, the photos from my neighbor showing her nephew with spray paint and eggs, and finally, the recordings from my cameras, anonymous figures leaving notes, shadows that matched the outline of Karen's nephew, each piece placed carefully, one after another, like bricks in a wall she could not climb. The board shuffled, their eyes darting between papers. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. For the first time, Karen's smile faltered. She stood again, desperate now, her voice sharper than before. Lies, all of it, fabricated to make me look guilty. But her words trembled, and the crowd could hear it. Truth has a way of cutting deeper than shouting. I leaned forward, meeting her eyes across the room. If following every rule, if documenting every action, if defending myself against harassment makes me a criminal in your eyes, then maybe the problem isn't me. The room went still, so quiet I could hear the hum of the old lights above. The head of the board sighed, rubbed his temples, and finally spoke. We cannot remove a resident for owning a car. His voice was heavy, reluctant. And given this evidence, we must also address misconduct within the HOA leadership. Karen's eyes widened, her face red with fury. She slammed her papers on the table, stood so fast her chair fell back. You're making a mistake, she screamed. This neighborhood is mine. I built it, I run it, and I will not be humiliated by him. Her voice cracked, high and broken. The crowd gasped, some even recording closer now, and for the first time she looked small, not powerful, not untouchable, just small. The board called for order, but control had already slipped away. Neighbors whispered. Some laughed under their breath. Karen stormed out, her heels clacking against the floor, her robe flaring like a cape of defeat. The door slammed so hard it echoed across the hall. The hearing ended in chaos. No clear punishment, no official verdict. But the truth was clear to everyone who sat in that room. Karen had lost, not just in rules, but in reputation. I walked out into the gray afternoon, neighbors staring as I passed. Some nodded, quiet respect in their eyes. Others avoided me still, too scared of her shadow. But the power had shifted. I could feel it in the air that night. I sat on my porch. The Rolls-Royce gleamed under the streetlight. Calm. Silent. Karen's porch light was still on across the street, but she wasn't there for the first time. Her chair sat empty. I should have felt relief. I should have celebrated, but instead, I felt something else. Dread. Because people like Karen don't just lose and walk away. They plan. They plot. They wait for the perfect chance to strike back. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Days passed quietly. Too quietly. No letters. No fin. No meetings. Just silence. And that silence was worse than the noise. I found myself looking over my shoulder, checking my cameras twice, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The quiet wasn't peace. It was waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was building something bigger, something I couldn't see yet. One night, I heard a noise outside, not loud, just a soft scrape against the fence. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped into the yard. The beam cut across the grass, across the driveway, across the Rolls-Royce, and there it was, another note, pinned under my wiper blade. This one was short, just 4 words. You haven't seen hell. My stomach sank. My hand tightened on the paper, and across the street, her porch light flicked on. The paper felt heavy in my hand, heavier than words should ever feel. Just 4 words, written in black ink. But they carried something darker than any fine or violation. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. I looked across the street. Her porch light was glowing again. No movement. No shadow behind the blinds, just light, steady and unblinking, like an eye watching me, like a warning that she was always there. I sat in my living room that night with the note on the table. The words seemed to echo in the silence. You haven't seen hell. What did she mean? What else could she do? She had already dragged me to HOA court, already humiliated me in front of neighbors, already sent her nephew to vandalize my home. What was left, I barely slept. Every sound outside jolted me awake. Every shadow through the curtains made my pulse race. But nothing happened. Not that night, not the next. And that was the worst part. The waiting. Karen disappeared from the porch. Her car rarely moved. No letters, no calls, no meetings, just silence. And in that silence, paranoia grew. Neighbors avoided me more than ever. Some wouldn't even look in my direction. Others whispered as I passed. I felt like a ghost walking through streets that used to feel alive. Karen had poisoned the well, and I was drinking alone. Then, small things began happening. Trash cans knocked over in the night, a crack in my fence that hadn't been there before, dog poop left carefully in the center of my lawn. Petty things, childish things. But I knew the message. She wanted me restless, angry, unstable. She wanted me to lose my calm so she could win the war. I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I documented everything. I saved photos. I filed quiet reports. I built my wall of evidence higher, because sooner or later, Karen would make a mistake again, and when she did, I would be ready. But then, things escalated. It was a Friday evening. I was driving home after grabbing groceries. As I turned into the neighborhood, I noticed something strange. Cars lined both sides of the street, dozens of them, people standing on lawns, gathering in groups, pointing toward my house. My stomach tightened. I pulled into my driveway slowly, and that's when I saw it. My Rolls Royce, covered in toilet paper, eggs dripping down the windshield, yolks sliding across the hood like yellow scars, spray paint across the side doors. One ugly word stretched across both panels. Outsider. I dropped the groceries, bags splitting open on the driveway. Neighbors laughed, whispered. Some filmed on their phones, and at the center of it all, across the street, stood Karen. Not smiling this time, not yelling, just standing, arms folded, watching me drown in humiliation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run across the street and demand answers, but I didn't. I stood still, fists clenched, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. And then, slowly, I pulled out my phone and started recording. Every second, every whisper, every laugh, every smear of paint dripping down the car I had worked so hard for. Karen saw me recording. Her eyes narrowed. Her jaw tightened, because she knew. This time, the evidence wasn't hidden. It was public. The police arrived minutes later, called not by me, but by someone else who probably wanted the spectacle to end. The officers looked at the car, at the crowd, at Karen standing proudly on her lawn, and then they looked at me. "Do you know who did this?" one asked. I didn't answer with words. I just turned my phone toward Karen. The crowd went silent. Her face froze. Pale in the flashing lights, she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The officers filed their report, took my statement, promised an investigation. Neighbors drifted back to their homes, their phones full of videos they would no doubt replay all weekend, and I was left standing in the driveway, staring at the wreck of my Rolls Royce. It wasn't just vandalism, it was war turned nuclear. I cleaned what I could, but some damage couldn't be erased. The spray paint bled into the metal, scars that no polish could hide. I sat on the porch afterward, exhausted, broken, staring at the ruined car like it was a wounded soldier. And across the street, Karen finally smiled. That smile burned into me. It wasn't joy, it was victory. And I realized then, she didn't care if I stayed or left. She didn't care if she won in rules or in court. She only cared about one thing, breaking me. I felt something shift inside me that night, something hard, something sharp. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to fight back, with everything I had. The next day, I met with my lawyer. We sat in his office for hours, going through evidence, reports, photos, videos, piece by piece. We built a case, not just harassment, not just vandalism, but targeted abuse, defamation, criminal mischief. It was all there, enough to drag her into real court. Not just HOA theater, but as we prepared the case, a thought kept nagging at me. How far would she go to stop me? Would she lie again? Would she manipulate the board? Would she rally the neighbors? Or would she do something even darker? Something I couldn't predict. That night, I stared out the window at her porch light. It flickered once, twice, then went dark. For the first time since I moved in, her light was gone, and the street felt darker than ever. I sat there in silence, gripping the arm of the chair, asking myself one question. Was this the calm before her final strike? Or was it the moment she finally realized she was losing? The night her porch light went dark, the street felt hollow. I stood at my window staring into the black across the road. For months that light had burned like a watchtower, a reminder she was always there. And now, nothing. Silence. Shadows. Emptiness. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like a trap. I hardly slept. Every creak in the house made me tense. Every gust of wind against the shutters made me flinch. When the sun finally rose, The neighborhood looked the same as always. Perfect lawns, painted mailboxes, quiet streets. But to me, it felt like a stage set for the final act. The first strike came in the form of a letter, not taped to my door, not slid under the mat, delivered by certified mail. Inside was a notice of intent to sue, not the HOA this time. Karen herself, the claims were laughable. Harassment, intimidation, emotional distress. She painted herself as the victim, and me, the monster. She had flipped the story, rewritten herself as the hero fighting against the outsider, and she was ready to drag me through real court to prove it. I sat with the letter in my hands, laughing at first, then shaking, because even if the claims were nonsense, fighting them would cost time, money, energy, and that was her plan. She didn't want to win in court. She wanted to bury me in the process. I met with my lawyer again. He shook his head, already expecting this move, but when I showed him the photos, the notes, the vandalism reports, his face hardened. "We don't just defend this," he said. "We counterattacks. Oh, we filed too. Our lawsuit laid out months of harassment, vandalism, false reports, defamation. It was thick, heavy, undeniable. Karen had wanted a war. Now she had one. The days leading up to court felt endless. Neighbors avoided me more than ever. Some whispered that I was suing the HOA queen. Others looked at me with pity, like I had no chance. But I didn't care anymore. This wasn't about their approval. It was about justice. The morning of the trial. The courthouse smelled of old paper and polish. Karen arrived first, flanked by her lawyer, her hair perfect, her face tight with confidence. She didn't look at me as I entered, but I felt the heat of her hatred radiating across the room. To her, this was the final showdown. To me, it was the only way to end it. The judge called us forward. Karen's lawyer spoke first, painting me as some arrogant newcomer who disrespected rules, who threatened harmony, who terrorized her with wealth and defiance. The words were sharp, but hollow, lies dressed as facts. The neighbors in the audience nodded, whispering as if they believed it. Then it was my turn. My lawyer stood calm, steady, his voice even but firm. He laid out the timeline, violation letters, the lipstick note, the vandalism, the recordings. One by one, the pieces of evidence stacked up like bricks, forming a wall she could not climb. Photos of her nephew with spray paint, recordings of her voice screaming false claims, notes in her handwriting dripping with venom. The courtroom grew still, and for the first time, Karen's mask cracked. She shifted in her seat, her jaw clenched, her eyes darting between the judge and the crowd. Her confidence began to slip, and when my lawyer played the video of her screaming, "He stole that car!" as police cuffed me, the room gasped. The judge's eyes narrowed, her lie exposed in front of everyone. Karen tried to speak, tried to twist the narrative, but the judge cut her off. The gavel hit the desk. Enough. When the ruling came, it was swift. Her lawsuit against me was dismissed. My counterclaims were upheld. She was found guilty of harassment, defamation, property damage through her nephew, fines, restitution, legal fees, all of it falling on her shoulders like a collapsing house of cards. The room erupted in whispers. Some neighbors looked shocked, others almost relieved. And Karen, for the first time, was silent. No shouting, no smiling, no threats, just silence. When it was over, I walked out of that courtroom free. The sun outside felt different, warm, clean. But as I stepped onto the courthouse steps, I saw her standing in the distance, her eyes burning, her lips trembling. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because her look said it all. This wasn't the end. Not for her. Weeks passed after the trial. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer. The board quietly replaced her as president. New rules were drafted. Fairer ones. Some neighbors even apologized to me in whispers at their mailboxes. And for the first time since I moved in, my driveway felt like mine again. But Karen never truly disappeared. Her porch light still flickered on some nights. Sometimes I'd see her car parked crookedly in her driveway, as if to remind me she was still there. Her empire was broken, but her spirit was not. And that was the truth about people like her. They don't vanish. They linger. They wait for cracks to appear so they can crawl back in. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. The Rolls-Royce sat polished and perfect in the driveway for the first time in months. It gleamed without eggs, without paint, without shame. But even in that peace, I knew the war had left scars. On the car, on me, on the neighborhood itself, Karen had lost. But in some ways, we had all lost, because the truth about battles like these is that even when yipituaiki, I'll win, the shadow of the fight never leaves. I leaned back, breathed deep, and asked myself the question that still haunted me. Was it worth it? Was any of this worth it? Just to park my car in my own driveway,